In every era, stories shape the world as much as the world shapes stories. The tales we tell, the myths we inherit, and the figures we remember or choose to forget define the landscape of our spiritual imagination. Among the most potent and enduring of these stories is the one that stretches across centuries and civilizations. The story of a figure whose very presence in narratives has sparked debate, reflection, fear, and fascination. This is the story of the one they erased and the deep reasons behind that erasure. It is also the story of why, even when voices seek to silence or sideline, memory remains not just an act of recollection, but an act of courage and necessity. To understand why anyone or anything is erased from a story, we must begin by exploring the power of narrative itself. Stories are not just idle entertainments. They are the architecture of our beliefs, the scaffolding of our values, and the canvas upon which we paint the grand pictures of good and evil, hope and despair, faith and doubt. When a figure is edited out, erased, or reimagined, the reasons are seldom trivial. They often speak volumes about the anxieties, aspirations, and priorities of the moment. The controversy that unfolded around the 2013 miniseries The Bible and its subsequent film adaptation, Son of God, offers a vivid modern parable about these deeper currents. When the actor portraying Satan in the Bible was said to resemble then-President Barack Obama, a storm of media attention, online debate, and public scrutiny followed. Producers Roma Downey and Mark Burnett, faced with the firestorm, made a decision. For Son of God, they would remove the character of Satan entirely. Their explanation was simple but profound. They wanted to avoid unnecessary controversy and keep the focus on Jesus. At first glance, this might seem like a simple matter of creative discretion. But beneath the surface, this choice reveals much about how our culture wrestles with the presence of evil, the ethics of representation, and the fragility of public discourse. It is a reminder that the figures we choose to depict or not depict in our communal stories are never just passive characters. They are symbols, lightning rods, and mirrors reflecting our deepest fears and hopes. But why does the presence or absence of this figure matter so much? To answer that question, we must look beyond the narrow confines of one television series or one moment of controversy. We must journey back through the centuries, tracing the shadowy outlines of this figure as he appears and disappears from the pages of Scripture, the whispers of tradition, and the imagination of generations. In the biblical tradition, the figure commonly known as Satan, or the adversary, occupies a complex and evolving role. He is the tempter in the wilderness, the accuser in the court of heaven, the serpent in the garden, and the shadow lurking at the edge of every human decision. His presence is never just about external evil. Rather, he embodies the tensions and struggles within every human heart, the perennial battle between light and darkness, faithfulness and betrayal, hope and despair. Yet, the figure of Satan is not static. Across centuries, his portrayal has shifted, reflecting the changing concerns and beliefs of those who told his story. In the Hebrew Bible, he is not always the horned villain of later imagination, but sometimes a heavenly prosecutor, a tester of faith, a cosmic opponent whose purpose is to challenge and refine. In Christian scripture, his role grows more stark and dramatic, embodying the force of opposition to God's purposes and the antagonist to the redemptive work of Christ. In art, literature, and theology, Satan has been variously demonized, personified, and at times even subtly humanized. He has served as a warning, a scapegoat, a symbol of rebellion, and a foil against which the light of goodness shines all the brighter. His erasure, then, is not simply the deletion of a character, but the removal of a vital tension from the story, a tension that forces us to grapple with the reality of evil, the complexity of choice, and the necessity of grace. When the producers of Son of God chose to remove Satan, they did so to avoid controversy, to keep the narrative unclouded by the distractions of contemporary politics and public perception. Yet in doing so, they also enacted a kind of forgetting, a silencing of the voice that has always whispered in one form or another at the edges of the sacred story. This act of erasure is emblematic of a broader tendency in every age to simplify, to sanitize, to make the story easier to tell and easier to hear. But stories are not meant to be easy. The power of the biblical narrative, and indeed of all great stories, lies in their refusal to flinch from complexity. The presence of the adversary is not just a narrative device, but a theological necessity. Without the reality of opposition, the triumph of good becomes hollow. Without the shadow, the light loses its brilliance. To erase the antagonist is to diminish the heroism of the protagonist. To deny the struggle is to cheapen the victory. This is why remembrance matters. Throughout Scripture, the call to remember is not just an act of nostalgia, but a spiritual discipline. Remember Jesus Christ, raised from the dead, descended from David, as proclaimed by my gospel, writes Paul in 2 Timothy 2:8. The act of remembrance grounds faith, fortifies hope, and steels the soul against the storms of forgetfulness and confusion. In the ritual of the Lord's Supper, Jesus' words echo through the ages. Do this in remembrance of me. To remember is to participate anew in the reality of redemption, to refuse the amnesia that would erase pain, victory, or meaning. But remembrance is not just about recalling the good. It is also about facing the reality of the broken, the painful, the difficult. It is about telling the whole story, with all its shadows and light, all its doubts and certainties, all its defeats and deliverances. The choice to erase the adversary from our stories is, in one sense, a temptation to deny the depth of the struggle that defines the human condition. The real reason figures are erased from stories then often has less to do with external controversies and more to do with a deeper discomfort, a reluctance to face the reality of opposition, complexity, and ambiguity. It is easier, perhaps, to tell a story of light without shadows, of victory without struggle, of faith without doubt. But such stories, however comforting, are ultimately untrue. They do not prepare us for the realities of life, where the adversary still prowls, where the temptations are still real, and where the need for grace is as urgent as ever. To remember then is not just to recall a forgotten character or a censored scene. It is to embrace the full scope of the story, with all its tensions and challenges. It is to acknowledge that evil is real, that struggle is necessary, and that redemption is meaningful precisely because it is hard-won. In our own lives, the temptation to erase or ignore the difficult parts of our stories is ever present. We would rather forget the failures, the betrayals, the wounds and losses. We would rather gloss over the periods of doubt, the seasons of darkness, the moments when the adversary seemed to have the upper hand. But the wisdom of the biblical tradition, and indeed the wisdom of all great storytelling, is that redemption is found not in erasing the shadows, but in walking through them. The story of the erasure of Satan from Son of God serves then as a parable for our times. It reminds us of the pressures to conform, to sanitize, to make stories safe and uncontroversial. But it also challenges us to remember, to hold fast to the full narrative, to refuse the seductive simplicity of forgetting. In a world that often prefers the comfort of uncomplicated stories, the call to remember is an act of resistance. It is a refusal to let the past be rewritten, to let the complexities be smoothed away, to let the hard-won lessons of struggle be lost. It is a commitment to truth, even when that truth is difficult or inconvenient. This act of remembrance is not only about the stories we tell in church or on screen, but also about the stories we tell ourselves and each other every day. It is about facing the reality of our own inner adversaries, our own battles and temptations, our own moments of darkness. It is about recognizing that the presence of evil is not simply an external threat, but a challenge that calls forth our courage, our faith, and our reliance on grace. As we remember, we are invited not to despair, but to hope. For the story of the adversary is, ultimately, a story of defeat. The biblical narrative does not end in darkness, but in light. The presence of the tempter is not the final word. The final word is redemption, victory, and the triumph of love over all that opposes it. But to appreciate that victory, we must first acknowledge the reality of the battle. We must remember the antagonist, not to glorify or fixate upon evil, but to recognize the depth of the struggle and the greatness of the redemption. This is why, even when figures are erased from our stories, whether for reasons of controversy, convenience, or discomfort, we must remember. We must tell the whole story with all its shadows and light. We must resist the temptation to sanitize, to simplify, to make the narrative safe and palatable. For in the end, it is the full story that transforms us. It is the full story that prepares us for the challenges of life. And it is the full story that gives meaning to the victory we celebrate. To remember is to stand in the truth that evil is real, but it is not ultimate, that the struggle is hard, but it is not hopeless, that the adversary prowls, but he does not prevail. In every generation, the temptation to forget, to erase, to rewrite is strong, but the call to remember is stronger still. It is the call to faithfulness, to honesty, to the courage of facing the whole story. May we be people who remember not just the easy parts, but the hard parts, not just the victories, but the battles, not just the heroes, but the antagonists who make heroism necessary. For in remembering, we honor the truth. And in honoring the truth, we find the freedom, the hope, and the strength to live our own stories with courage and grace. As we reflect on the decision to remove Satan from Son of God, we are prompted to consider how our own narratives, personal, communal, and cultural, are shaped by what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget. The choice to erase is always a choice with consequences. It shapes not only the stories we tell, but the people we become. The biblical tradition, with its insistence on remembrance, offers a powerful corrective to the culture of erasure. It calls us to remember not only the mighty acts of God, but also the failures, the betrayals, the wilderness wanderings, and the times of exile. It refuses to flinch from the reality of evil, the pain of loss, and the depth of human brokenness. But it also insists that these are not the end of the story. They are the context in which redemption becomes possible and meaningful. In our own lives, the practice of remembrance can be transformative. To remember our failures is not to wallow in regret, but to learn, to grow, to become people of wisdom and compassion. To remember our battles is not to glorify struggle, but to recognize the strength that comes from perseverance. To remember the presence of the adversary is not to live in fear, but to live in vigilance, humility, and dependence on grace. The story of the one who was erased is, in the end, a story about the power of memory. It is a story about the necessity of facing the whole truth, however uncomfortable or controversial. And it is a story about the hope that comes from embracing the full narrative, the good, the bad, and the redemptive. As we move forward, may we be people who remember. May we tell the whole story with honesty and courage. May we resist the temptation to erase, to forget, to sanitize. For in remembering, we honor the past, we prepare for the future, and we live more fully in the present. The real reason they erased him from the Bible, or from the latest retelling of the Bible, is, in one sense, a symptom of our times. It is a reflection of the pressures of public perception, the anxieties of controversy, the desire for simplicity and clarity. But it is also an invitation to remember, to reckon, to refuse the easy path of forgetting. For the stories we remember shape the people we become, and the people we become will, in turn, shape the stories we leave for those who come after us. May our stories be full, honest, and true. May our memories be deep, robust, and faithful. And may we always remember, not just the heroes, but the antagonists, not just the victories, but the battles, not just the light, but the shadows that make the light shine brighter. For in remembering, we keep alive the hope, the wisdom, and the courage that every generation needs. The journey of memory is not always easy. It requires us to face uncomfortable truths, to acknowledge our own complicity in the patterns of forgetting, and to commit ourselves anew to the discipline of telling the whole story. But it is a journey worth taking, for it is in memory that we find both warning and inspiration, both challenge and comfort. As we remember the one who was erased, may we also remember the countless other stories, voices, and truths that have been silenced or sidelined over the centuries. May we become people of memory, people of truth, people of courage. For in the end, it is not the act of erasure that defines us, but the act of remembrance. It is not forgetting that leads to wisdom, but remembering. Even when the memories are difficult, even when the stories are complicated, may we remember. And in remembering, may we find the strength to live wisely, justly, and compassionately in a world that so often prefers the comfort of forgetting. The story of the erasure of Satan is just one chapter in a much larger saga, a saga of memory and forgetting, of truth and denial, of light and darkness. It is a story that invites us to look honestly at our own lives, at the stories we tell, and at the stories we inherit. Let us commit ourselves to the discipline of remembrance, not as an act of nostalgia, but as an act of courage, faith, and hope. Let us tell the whole story with all its complexity and challenge, and let us find in that story the wisdom, strength, and grace we need for the journey ahead. For the real reason they erased him from the Bible, or from the retelling of the Bible, is not just about controversy or politics. It is about the perennial human temptation to forget the hard parts, to smooth away the rough edges, to make the story easy. But the truth is never easy, and the story is never simple. May we be people who remember, who tell the whole story, and who find in that story the hope and the courage to live with wisdom, faith, and love. In the tapestry of human history, every thread matters. Every voice, every story, every memory contributes to the richness and depth of the whole. When we erase, we diminish. When we remember, we honor. May we be people who choose remembrance today and always. If this story moved you, share it with someone still wandering. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And if you carry a legend, a memory, or a haunting, leave it below. Perhaps your story will be the next ritual.